By the time the last espresso machine hissed itself quiet, my feet felt like they belonged to someone else. Soto Luz was winding down, but the rain outside kept rising, drumming the awning like it wanted in. I wiped the bar, smiled automatically, kept moving because stopping meant thinking hard. That's the trick when you're a single mom in Manhattan. You run on autopilot. Tips go into one envelope, rent into another, and whatever's left decides if Noah gets a new pair of sneakers. I was always counting, always listening for trouble, always staying small so nobody could take him. The dining room looked like a postcard someone paid to enter. White linen, soft gold lamps, polished glasses waiting for hands that never washed dishes. Tuesday nights were quieter, but quiet never meant safe. It only meant the loud people went elsewhere. And secrets stayed closer to the table's edge. In the far corner booth, the air bent around Damien Cross. No one said his name out loud unless they had to. He sat with his back to the wall, suit jacket open, hands still, eyes scanning without hurry. Even the silverware seemed to clink softer near him than usual. I'd served him twice before, and learned the rules fast. Don't linger. Don't flirt. Don't act brave. People like me got brave once and paid for it forever. Damien never touched the bourbon that waited by his elbow. He just watched rain, and listened to silence as if it spoke. Behind him, his right-hand man, Vince Caruso, ate like he was measuring bites. He wasn't looking at the menu, he was looking at people. The cooks slowed their voices when Vince passed the kitchen door. I pretended not to notice any of it, because noticing is dangerous when you're alone. Around 11:45 p.m., the last couple paid and left, trailing perfume and relief. I stacked chairs, checked the coat rack, and tried not to imagine Noah waking up and calling for me. Rainwater crawled down the windows in crooked lines, turning streetlights into smeared halos over the sidewalk below. My phone buzzed once with a photo from my neighbor, Mrs. Diaz. Noah asleep, one arm over his stuffed dinosaur. I exhaled so hard my ribs hurt. I texted back a thank you and a promise I'd be home soon, then tucked the phone away like a talisman against the night. That was when the back hallway changed, not with sound at first, but with stillness. The line cook paused mid-wipe. The dishwasher stopped clattering. I felt the hairs on my arms lift as if a cold draft had found the room's spine, even though every door was shut tight already. The emergency exit by the kitchen slammed inward like it had been kicked by the weather itself. A girl stumbled through, drenched head to toe, hoodie clinging, hair stuck to her face. She was young, maybe 18, and her breath came in jagged pulls. Red streaked her brow into rainwater. She didn't look at the tables first. She looked for an exit. Any exit, with the panic of someone who'd learned doors could turn into traps. Her eyes swept the room and landed on Damien's corner like it was the only wall that might hold. Then her knees buckled. She caught a chair and slid down anyway. I moved without choosing to. My body did what it did when a kid was in danger. It reached before it thought. The girl's hands shook against the carpet, and a bruise marked the line of her jaw. She tried to speak, but fear stole the shape of her words. Damien stood so fast his chair barely made a sound. He didn't hurry. He simply arrived, as if distance meant nothing to him. Vince shifted, one hand near his jacket, eyes narrowing toward the back door. A couple of diners froze with forks midair, suddenly remembering their families at home. The man who followed her stepped in like he was late to a meeting, not chasing someone terrified. Tall, rain-slicked, beard trimmed, expression smooth. He spread his hands in a gesture that said misunderstanding, family matter, nothing to see. He glanced around, assessing, then fixed on the girl with ownership. He spoke with that public service calm, like authority was a blanket he could throw over any mess. I understood the story he was selling. Guardian, troubled girl, Private emergency. The words sounded reasonable, but her body disagreed. She shook so hard the carpet trembled. And I'd seen fear before tonight. Damien didn't answer the performance. He didn't look impressed or angry. He looked focused, like a man lining up a shot only he could see. He lowered himself to one knee beside the girl, slow not to startle her. Up close, I saw her eyelashes dotted with rain and tears. The man hovered behind Damien, smile thinning, trying to keep control with politeness. Vince and two silent shadows at the bar angled their bodies, cutting off exits without touching anyone. It was choreography, not dance. My pulse hammered as the room chose sides, and I wondered which side held mercy. Damien's voice stayed low, almost gentle, and he asked one plain thing, whether she knew the man behind him. Her eyes clung to Damien's like a handhold in a flood. She leaned closer, lips barely moving, and whispered. The restaurant inhaled, every heartbeat waiting for the meaning of her confession. I didn't catch every syllable, but I felt the impact like heat. The man's smile faltered, his eyes flashing calculation. Damien stayed still, listening, deciding. My hands froze on the towel. In the next breath, the truth would surface, and I already knew it would burn through everything he'd built. Emily's whisper didn't sound like a sentence. It sounded like a door finally cracking open. I caught enough to understand what she was saying, and my stomach dropped cold. Behind Damien's shoulder, the man's smile faltered for half a breath, like he'd forgotten people were watching. The dining room went still in a way I'd never felt at work, not even during fights or walkouts. It wasn't awkward silence. It was the kind that comes right before a storm makes landfall, when everyone realizes the rules just changed. And somehow, in that instant, I knew her fear had a name. I looked at Emily's hands digging into the carpet, knuckles pale, and thought of Noah waking from a nightmare. Her cut was small, but it kept bleeding, mixing with rainwater, turning her cheek pink. The bruise along her jaw wasn't fresh makeup could hide. It was the kind that came from being grabbed, not bumped. She kept flinching at every movement behind Damien, like her body expected punishment for breathing. I felt anger rise so fast it scared me. If someone had ever cornered my kid like that, I would have burned the world down and not blinked once afterward. Caleb Harrow kept his voice soft, concerned, the way school counselors speak when they want you to relax. He acted like the victim was my imagination, and the problem was a tired teenager with a public episode. He reached into his jacket and produced folded papers, holding them out like a badge. I couldn't see the words, but I recognized the shape of authority. Letterhead, signatures, a neat diagnosis that turned a girl into a liability. He dropped a doctor's name as if it were a spell. He didn't have to drag Emily physically. The paperwork was his leash tonight. That was the part that made my skin crawl. A man like Caleb didn't need a knife when he had paperwork and a smile. The system loves clean stories. Respectable guardian, troubled girl, a concerned professional who wrote it down. The moment a file says unstable, people stop listening and start managing. I'd seen it in smaller ways. Tenants dismissed, moms labeled dramatic, workers told they were confused. If Caleb had already built a paper trail for Emily, he could do it to anyone who stood beside her, including me, including a single mom with rent overdue and no room for scandal. And then my memory betrayed me. I'd seen Caleb's face before, not in some dark alley, but on the bulletin board outside Noah's classroom. A glossy fundraiser flyer, bright colors and hopeful fonts, thanking an outreach network for after-school support. There he was, shaking hands beside the principal from pickup line mornings. I remembered thinking he looked safe, like the kind of man who'd donate backpacks. Now he stood in my restaurant, I insisting Emily was unstable. My throat tightened. If he was that close to Noah, and how kids paid for my mistake. Damien didn't argue with Caleb's story. He widened his focus, and the room obeyed. Vince moved first, not rushing, just placing himself where the back door was no longer an option. Two men I hadn't noticed at the bar shifted too, shoulders angled, eyes flat, as if the air itself had been hired. The kitchen staff stopped pretending to work. I felt the restaurant become a sealed box. Damien kept his attention on Emily, letting her breathe, letting her know she wasn't alone. Then he rose and faced Caleb. The calm Caleb wore started to fray in front of everyone. Everything after that moved like a checklist. Chairs scraped, coats were gathered. People were guided out with urgency that felt like steel under velvet. The front doors locked, the closed sign flipped, and the last bit of street noise vanished. I fetched a clean towel and a wool blanket, hands shaking, and crouched near Emily without crowding her. Someone set water in front of her. She gripped the glass like it could anchor her to the earth. Damien sat across from her instead of looming, and that choice mattered. Caleb stood alone, stripped of audience and advantage, at last, truly. Caleb tried to regain control with the only tools he trusted: legality and intimidation. He kept insisting he had rights, that Emily belonged to him on paper, that calling the police would end badly for everyone here. He hinted at friends in city offices, at lawyers who could make problems disappear, at phone numbers that opened doors. But he was talking into a wall. Damien's expression never warmed. Yet I saw a curve at the corner of his mouth, not humor, but warning. Caleb noticed it too. His confidence cracked into something smaller, and his breathing turned uneven at once. I kept thinking of Noah's face, his fist curled around a dinosaur, trusting I'd come back. Caleb's kind of power didn't stop when a door locked. It traveled through paperwork and whispers, through the way strangers loved a man on a flyer. If he lost Emily tonight, he'd hunt another lever. I felt it in my bones that witnesses became targets, and a waitress with a son was an easy story to rewrite. Damien's men could hold this room, but they couldn't hold my whole life. I needed to get home and act normal, even though normal was already gone. When I stepped out of Soto Luz, the rain hit me like a reprimand. Neon from the alley sign bled across puddles, and my hands still smelled faintly of sanitizer and fear. Behind me, the restaurant had become a sealed box full of power and paperwork, but the city outside didn't care. I walked fast, head down, keys threaded between my fingers the way my mother taught me, because tonight felt like a night that collected mistakes. I kept picturing Noah, safe because I hurried. On the train uptown, I tried to breathe like a normal person. I watched commuters stare at phones, at ads, at nothing, and I wondered how many of them carried a secret the way Emily did. My phone showed my bank balance without mercy, and my mind did the usual math: rent, daycare, groceries, the court fee from the last custody filing. I told myself the danger was locked behind restaurant doors. My body didn't believe me. Every stop sounded too loud, every shadow close. My building smelled like wet concrete and someone's late-night takeout. The lobby light flickered, and the security camera above the mailboxes looked more decorative than real. I climbed the stairs because the elevator made noise, and noise invited attention. On the third floor, the hallway was empty, but my skin prickled anyway. I listened for doors closing, for footsteps, for the tiny sounds that mean you are not alone. Nothing answered, and that scared me more. I kept my key ready, thumb on the ridge. At my door, the first thing I saw was wrongness without a name. The deadbolt was turned the way I left it, but the paint around the strike plate looked freshly scraped, a thin crescent of pale wood showing through. The chain inside hung at a slightly different angle, as if someone had tugged it and let it fall. I stared until my eyes watered. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the building was old. But my instincts kept whispering that someone had tried and stopped. I slipped in, locked the door twice, then stood in the kitchen with my back to the fridge, breathing through my teeth. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the motor and the rattle of rain on the fire escape. I washed my hands until the water ran hot and my knuckles turned red, like I could scrub away Emily's eyes. When I stepped into Noah's room, he was asleep on his side, dinosaur under his chin, mouth open safe. I prayed hard. Seeing him like that made my chest ache with a fierce kind of love that felt like pain. I wanted to go back in time and unsee everything, but I couldn't. I pictured Caleb on that fundraiser flyer and imagined him smiling at parents in the pickup line. The thought made me sick. If someone tried to label me unstable the way they labeled Emily, would anyone listen to a waitress with a rent notice? Would a judge hear my voice, or just the paperwork? A soft knock came from the hall, not the neighbor kind, but measured, patient. My blood turned to ice. I glanced at Noah, then at the kitchen knife block, then hated myself for thinking like that. I moved to the peephole. Vince Caruso stood outside, coat damp, face unreadable, hands visible. He didn't crowd the door. He waited as if he knew exactly how fear worked. When I cracked the chain, his eyes flicked past me, checking the apartment with a professional scan without asking. He didn't waste motion. The warning sat in his posture and in the way he kept his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. He never glanced toward Noah's room, and that restraint told me he understood what mattered. Vince made it plain that Caleb was not the kind of man who accepted losing. Men like that looked for leverage. He also made it plain that Damien had places for emergencies, quiet places where questions stayed outside. It was help, but like stepping blind anyway. I stood there with the chains still on, weighing two kinds of terror. One was staying, pretending my door was safe because the locks clicked. The other was leaving with a man I barely knew, into a world I'd avoided on purpose. I looked at Noah and the choice made itself. I gathered his certificate, my custody papers, my phone charger, and the cash envelope from the cereal box. I slid his dinosaur into the bag, because comfort is survival when you're 6 for him. Noah didn't wake when I lifted him, but his weight settled against my shoulder like trust. I carried him to the door, eased the chain open, and followed Vince into the hallway. The air out there felt colder, like the building had been holding its breath. Vince guided me down the stairs without rushing, as if speed itself could trigger panic. Outside, a dark car waited, engine quiet. I climbed in with my son and realized I'd crossed a line I could never uncross tonight. We drove without small talk, the wipers pushing rain aside like it could be reasoned with. Noah slept against my shoulder, heavy and trusting, while my mind kept replaying the scraped paint on my door and Emily's shaking hands on the carpet. Vince sat up front beside the driver, a dark outline in the glass, and I felt escorted by Damien's world. The city blurred past in wet streaks, so traffic lights smearing red and green across the windshield. When the car finally turned onto a quiet block, the noise dropped off so suddenly my ears rang. A brownstone waited between two similar faces, its windows dim, its stoop dry under an awning. No sign, no camera glaring, just a door that looked ordinary on purpose. My stomach tightened. Ordinary was never ordinary anymore. I hugged Noah closer, smelling shampoo and crayons, and wondered what kind of night I had entered. Inside, the foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and clean linens, not perfume or smoke. A single lamp threw warm light across framed photos turned slightly away from view. I noticed the practical things first. 2 locks, a solid chain, a peephole, and a second door deeper in the hall that looked reinforced. Vince guided me in, and then stepped back as an older woman appeared from the stairs with the calm authority of someone who has seen emergencies before. Mrs. Whitman moved like a former nurse, quiet hands, steady eyes, no curiosity in her face. She didn't demand names or explanations. She simply took Noah's coat, checked his forehead with the back of her fingers, and motioned toward the kitchen where steam rose from a pot. The kindness landed strangely, like a blanket dropped on a wound that was still bleeding. For a moment, I forgot who owned this safety. She led us upstairs to a small bedroom that already had fresh sheets and a nightlight glowing blue. Noah stirred, eyes half open, then settled when Mrs. Whitman spoke in a soothing rhythm I could feel more than hear. She set a bowl of soup in my hands and another for him, and then filled a cup with warm milk and placed it on a coaster, like this was any ordinary bedtime. I watched her move through drawers as if she'd stocked them for kids, pulling out soft pajamas and a towel. Somewhere, a bath started running, water thumping gently through pipes. Outside, the rain softened from attack to whisper, and the quiet made my guilt louder. I kept thinking I had dragged my son into a stranger's house because a man on a school flyer might come knocking. I swallowed soup I couldn't taste and tried to steady my hands. Downstairs, Emily sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a wool blanket that swallowed her whole. Her hair was still damp, and she flinched when the radiator clicked. I sat at the edge of an armchair, careful not to crowd her, and felt my anger shift into something heavier, a kind of grief that didn't know where to go. She spoke in fragments, pausing to breathe, wiping her face with the blanket like she was apologizing for existing. I pieced together the shape of it. Caleb had been using charm as a lock and paperwork as a key. When she tried to tell someone, he produced doctor letters, tidy diagnoses, and a story about episodes. He kept her isolated, pulled her from school, monitored her phone, and turned every adult into another closed door. The outreach centers weren't charity, she implied. They were a machine built to find forgotten girls. Then she mentioned the place Caleb hid behind, and my pulse spiked. She described the logo printed on the outreach brochures, a little lighthouse inside a circle, with the words Harbor Light Youth Network underneath. I had seen that exact lighthouse taped to Noah's classroom door next to a list of snack donations. I had handed over $10 at a fundraiser, grateful for any program that promised after-school care. My knees went weak as the realization slid into place. Caleb hadn't just been near my son. He'd been welcomed into our world as a helper. The thought made me feel dirty, like I'd let a stranger hold Noah's hand in a crowd. Emily's story wasn't far away anymore. It was woven into the same community emails and school events that kept my life running. I stared at the walls and understood predators don't always break in. They're invited. I wanted to believe this brownstone could freeze time, that locks and quiet could keep the world out. But Emily's fragments pointed past Caleb, on toward offices that had accepted his letters and adults who'd praised him. Hiding might protect us tonight, but it couldn't erase a machine built on signatures and silence. I pictured my scraped door and understood we needed more than shelter. We needed proof the way courts respect and headlines can't twist. Vince stepped into the hallway and made a call, voice low. I didn't catch the exchange, only the name he used like a key, Detective Renee Torres. It steadied me and scared me at once. Police meant statements and questions about my life, my custody, my job. Still, I watched Noah sleeping in borrowed sheets and chose the hard path. If I wanted my son safe, I had to drag truth into daylight right now. The brownstone was so quiet it felt staged. Noah had finally fallen back asleep upstairs. The kind of sleep only kids can manage after being carried through rain, and I kept listening for the sound that would prove this calm was a lie. Mrs. Whitman moved around the kitchen like she owned time itself, rinsing bowls, folding a towel, never asking why my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Vince stood near the front window, half shadow, half guard. Then the doorbell rang once, controlled, and every muscle in my body tightened. I told myself it was arriving, not trouble finding us. Detective Renee Torres stepped in with rain on her blazer and a look that said she had already read the ending of most stories. She didn't glance at Vince for permission, and she didn't look around for Damien the way other people did. She simply scanned the foyer, the stairwell, the exits, the locks, as if the house were evidence. Her eyes landed on me and held for a second, not judging, just cataloging. Then she nodded toward the living room, and everyone moved without a single raised voice. In that moment, I felt her control settle the air around. Emily was on the couch, blanket tucked under her chin, knees drawn tight. Torres crouched in front of her, close enough to see the bruise line and the raw edge of her cut, but not so close that Emily had to shrink away. Torres watched her hands, the way her fingers kept twisting fabric like a lifeline. I saw Emily notice it too. The detective wasn't looking for a performance. She was looking for truth in posture, in breath, in the pauses between words. For the first time all night, Emily's shoulders lowered a fraction, and belief arrived quietly there. Torres guided Emily through the timeline in careful steps, not circling back when details blurred, letting her breathe when panic rose. Emily described control disguised as care: phone checks, locked doors, sudden homeschooling, and a constant warning that no one would believe her. When Emily mentioned doctor papers, Torres asked for specifics, not sympathy. I watched Emily explain how the documents followed her like a shadow, how every adult saw the letterhead and stopped hearing her voice. My jaw clenched. I'd spent years being treated as less credible because I worked nights. Now I was watching a teenager erased by ink. Then it was my turn. Torres didn't ask me to be brave. She asked me to be precise. I told her what I saw at Soto Luz, what I recognized on Caleb's face, what my door looked like when I got home. Saying it out loud made it sound impossible, and I hated that. And I kept thinking about a family court judge, about a supervisor at the restaurant, about how quickly people decide a single mom is unstable when she raises her voice. Torres wrote everything down anyway. She asked about Noah without prying, like she understood leverage too well. When Emily finally said Caleb's full name and the outreach network, I saw Torres's pen stop in midline. It wasn't dramatic, just a pause that felt louder than the rain. Her eyes lifted, not to Emily, but to a point on the wall as if she was pulling a file from memory. She resumed writing, but slower. In that tiny hesitation, I heard the truth. This wasn't a one-house nightmare. It was a pattern. Torres asked Emily to describe the Harbor Light logo, the locations, the donors. Emily's voice shook, but it was treated as evidence. Torres stepped into the hallway where Damien stood, half in shadow, like the house had been built around his silence. I didn't hear their words, only the shape of them. Torres's posture said rules mattered. Damien's stillness said consequences did too. They looked at each other the way two people look at a bridge they've crossed before, each time pretending it was the last. I sensed history there, not friendship, not truce, something functional and uneasy. Vince waited nearby, eyes down, listening for cues. Whatever they agreed on would keep Emily alive without handing the defense corruption to use later. Later, when I came downstairs for water, I found Mrs. Whitman folding a blanket with a practiced tenderness. She mentioned, almost to herself, that Damien had built this place after losing someone young, on someone who vanished and never came back. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, but the image stayed. A family waiting by a phone, a door that never opened. It explained Damien's restraint more than any rumor ever could. He wasn't saving Emily to look noble. He was fighting a ghost in his own history, and tonight, the ghost had Emily's face. It softened my fear, somehow. Before Torres left, she made it clear the case wouldn't move on outrage alone. Powerful networks required careful proof, and rushing meant losing. She mapped the next steps in plain terms: official statements, records, subpoenas, names, dates, money trails. My throat tightened because paper had been Caleb's weapon, and now paper would be ours. Damien didn't interrupt. Through Vince, and he signaled Emily would stay protected and tips would reach Torres through clean channels. When the door shut, the safe house felt less like hiding and more like planning. I understood truth survives when it becomes receipts, and we started tonight. Mornings at the brownstones started with the same soft lies. Cereal in a chipped bowl, cartoons turned low, and Noah asking if we could go back home after school. I kept smiling because moms learned to smile through alarms, but my mind stayed on signatures and locks all day long. Emily slept late, then woke with eyes that never fully focused on the room. Mrs. Whitman offered tea and clean socks without questions, and that steadiness was its own medicine. Vince rotated men outside, quiet as furniture. I watched the front stoop like it might grow teeth before night returned. Detective Torres didn't visit every day, but her work did. Forms arrived in plain folders. She asked for timelines, addresses, donor names, and dates. And I learned that memory becomes sturdier when you pin it to paper. I wrote until my wrist ached, afraid to miss one detail ever again. The outreach centers looked innocent on the surface. Youth mentoring, tutoring, weekend events, smiling photos. Torres pulled grant applications and board minutes, and the language sounded warm, holy. Yet every page carried the same lighthouse logo that had hung beside Noah's homework chart. I felt my throat tighten each time. Caleb's favorite weapon was still the medical file. Torres requested Emily's so-called evaluations, and I saw how easy it is to turn a girl into a diagnosis. Dr. Marcus Reeves' name appeared. He stamped beside terms like delusional and fabrication, as if truth were a symptom to be managed by adults. Torres explained, in her blunt way, that courts don't run on outrage. They run on documents, witnesses, and patterns. She asked me to list every place I remembered seeing Harbor Light branding, every parent email, every fundraiser banner. My life became a spreadsheet of fear, and I filled it anyway. Some days, the safe house felt like a bunker with a toy box. Noah built Lego towers on the rug, while I read subpoenas at the dining table. He asked why grown-ups wrote so much. I told him writing helps people remember, and he nodded like that made perfect sense. The first crack in Caleb's shield came from the doctor he hid behind. Torres finally brought Dr. Marcus Reeve in, and the pressure wasn't loud. It was procedural. License reviews, financial audits, the threat of perjury. Reeve arrived polished and confident, but his hands betrayed him before his words did. What happened spread through the case like sunlight. Reeve didn't confess because he grew a conscience overnight. He folded because paper cuts deeper when it becomes evidence. He handed over emails, invoices, and notes proving he never examined Emily. He signed what Caleb wanted for money routed through a nonprofit. Torres used Reeve's documents to pry open everything else. She subpoenaed Harbor Light's payroll and found staff paid in cash. She pulled visitor logs from Caleb's house and matched dates to donor dinners. She requested bank statements, and the same circle of names kept appearing, respectable, shielded by warm language. The satisfaction hit me in places I'd be buttering Noah's toast and realize a lie had been pinned down. I'd fold laundry and imagine courts reading Reeve's emails. For a moment, I could breathe. Then Torres mentioned another girl with the same diagnosis, filed years earlier, now missing from records. Once Torres pulled that thread, more names surfaced. A shelter in Newark, a Hartford admission, a girl who aged out of Harbor Light and vanished. Each story echoed Emily's: isolation, paperwork, adults turning away. The network wasn't rumor anymore. It was a map widening as if the city were complicit. Noah tried to keep life simple. He drew a lighthouse with a smiling sun and asked if lighthouses saved people. My throat closed. I told him lighthouses are supposed to guide you home, and he colored the door red. I kept the drawing. I'm proof kids believe in safety at first. That belief made the next moment worse. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitman brought in Noah's backpack from the stoop, and the zipper pocket was unzipped. Nothing was missing, but a new keychain had been clipped to the handle. A metal lighthouse, identical to Harbor Light's logo. My hands went numb instantly. I stared at it until rage filled my vision. Whoever did it wasn't trying to steal. They were reminding me they could reach the edges of my motherhood, the places I couldn't guard. Ever. Vince removed the keychain and tossed it into a bag like it was poisonous for now. Torres called, and I heard urgency under her calm. She said the intimidation was another thread, proof of coordination. Then she told me Sandra Carter had been calling her office for answers about Emily. The case was moving from files into blood. I looked upstairs and heard Noah breathe steady. Emily didn't know her mother was reaching out yet. She sat by the window mornings, pigeons hopping along the ledge, hands wrapped around a mug, as if warmth could teach her body safety. I wanted to protect her from pain, but I knew truth doesn't spare feelings. It arrives anyway. That night I packed Noah's lunch, even though we weren't going anywhere. Habit is how you keep sanity when control is gone. I tucked his lighthouse drawing into his backpack and traced the crayon lines with my thumb, promising myself I would build safety, not beg for it from anyone. By morning, Torres's plan expanded into warrants, and Damien's protection tightened like a net. I didn't feel safe, but I felt ready. The keychain proved they were watching, and Sandra's calls proved the next blow would be human. Evidence was building, and the fallout was walking toward our door soon. By the time the subpoenas started stacking in Torres's folders, I felt older than my 31 years. The brownstones stayed quiet, but it was the kind of quiet you borrow, not the kind you own. Noah ate his cereal at the table like nothing had changed, and I kept my voice light while my mind ran on dates and signatures. Emily drifted through the rooms like a person learning gravity again. Mrs. Whitman kept tea warm and lights low. Outside, the city kept moving, pretending it hadn't swallowed girls whole. Each stair creak felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. Late that afternoon, Vince checked the peephole, then stepped aside for me. A woman stood on the stoop with her coat still on and rain marks on her sleeves, clutching a purse to her chest like a shield. I didn't need an introduction to know she was Emily's mother. My first thought wasn't sympathy. It was Noah upstairs and the lighthouse keychain that had appeared on his backpack. Mrs. Whitman stayed near the stairs, calm as a nurse in triage. Vince watched the street, not her face. The house tightened around us. My pulse climbed. I forced my voice steady. Emily heard the door before she saw it. Her shoulders rose toward her ears, and her eyes found the exit as if she was counting steps the way I did in subway stations. I went to her first, because I knew what it felt like to be cornered by someone else's choices. I told her, in the softest way I could manage, that her mother was downstairs asking for her, while Emily shook her head hard, not dramatic, just final. The message was clear. She could survive courtrooms, but not that conversation yet. I promised I wouldn't let anyone touch her. Sandra stepped into the foyer like she expected someone to tell her she was too late. Her hair was pulled back in a knot, and there were half moons under her eyes that looked like bruises made by sleep deprivation. She kept glancing toward the stairs, trying to see through walls. When I told her Emily wasn't ready, Sandra's face collapsed. She pressed her lips together and nodded too many times, as if agreement could erase damage. Then she said the thing she had left. She hadn't known. The words hung there, true and useless, filling the room with smoke. She tried to explain how Caleb wrapped their life in charity language. He brought her to fundraisers, and posed for brochures, and came home acting gentle. He warned her Emily was unstable, that trauma made teens invent stories, and he claimed a trusted doctor had confirmed it. Sandra believed the letterhead. She believed the clinic photos and the diagnoses she barely understood. She believed the way Caleb sounded like a worried parent, not a man building a cage. As she spoke, anger burned in my throat because the system trained her to trust paper over fear. That trust became Emily's lock. I wanted to scream that mothers are supposed to know, but I also knew how predators hunt exhaustion. Sandra worked, paid bills, chased stability, and Caleb offered it with a smile. I understood that temptation because I felt it too, every time help came with invisible strings. Still, understanding didn't erase the damage. Emily tried to speak, and Sandra accepted the easier story, the one supported by letterhead and calm voices. In my world, the easier story is the one that hurts a child. I watched Sandra's hands shake and pictured Noah asleep upstairs, trusting me to choose right today. Emily came down 2 steps, then stopped, as if the air itself was thicker around her mother. She didn't run into Sandra's arms, and she didn't scream. She simply held the banister and looked at her, eyes steady, breaking my heart. Emily made it clear she couldn't do this yet. She needed time, distance, and proof that apologies wouldn't turn into pressure. The boundary wasn't cruel, it was survival. Sandra reached for forgiveness and found a closed door, but not a locked one. Emily left the possibility of a future, just not tonight, and I thanked her for choosing herself. Sandra lingered as if she wanted to memorize Emily's face for later. Then she nodded, slow, and the strength went out of her shoulders. Mrs. Whitman handed her water, and Sandra's fingers shook around the glass. She didn't argue or demand. She looked wrecked, like someone who finally understood her love had been used against her child. Vince opened the door, and a slice of cold air entered. Sandra walked into it, coat unbuttoned, eyes fixed on nothing. After she left, the house stayed quiet, but the silence felt heavier. I realized justice isn't only arrests, it's private accounting afterward. That night I watched Noah sleep, backpack by the chair, and the world narrowed to his breathing. The lighthouse keychain proved someone knew where to aim. Torres's case was speeding up, and pressure outside the brownstone rose. Warrants, rumors, and then people protecting reputations. When paper shields crack, predators grab targets, and single moms are soft in every file. I checked my phone and saw missed calls and numbers. My job, my custody, my name could be rewritten. Downstairs, Vince was making calls. I understood the next chapter would be public, and I would have to keep Noah steady through it. By sunrise, the brownstone felt louder without anyone raising their voice. Phones kept lighting up on the kitchen counter. News alerts stacked like plates, and Vince's men started coming and going with that clipped, practiced speed that meant something had finally moved. I was buttering Noah's toast when Mrs. Whitman murmured that Torres had called. The warrants were live. The words sounded clean, almost polite. But my stomach twisted because I understood what came next. Doors forced open, reputations dragged into daylight, and people like me caught in the spray. By mid-morning, the city was talking. Caleb Harrow was taken in outside his manicured house, the same house that had been framed in Harbor Light brochures like a promise. Torres didn't send me video, just the facts, but the internet did the rest. A board member from the outreach network resigned before the handcuffs came. A donor with a Skyline office vanished from his own schedule. A community leader who used to cut ribbons at school events suddenly had a spokesperson and a statement about cooperating fully. I should have felt only relief, and some of me did. Emily sat at the table staring at her hands, and for the first time the shaking slowed. But the wave of exposure came with a second wave I didn't expect. Everyone scrambling to clean themselves. The same parents who had praised Harbor Light in group emails began posting that they'd always felt something off. The same nonprofits that had cashed Caleb's checks launched investigations with perfect timing. Watching it, I realized the system didn't change because it grew a heart. It changed because it got caught. That afternoon, my phone rang from a number I hadn't saved in years. I let it go to voicemail, because every sound in my life was already a demand, but the notification hit like a punch. Noah's father had heard. He didn't ask if Noah was safe. He didn't ask what I needed. He left a message that sounded like concern dressed up as superiority. I saying he was worried about the people I was around, and that he'd be speaking to his lawyer about custody. 2 hours later, the pressure moved from my phone to Noah's world. Mrs. Diaz texted that a man had been waiting near the school office, asking questions with my last name on his tongue. The staff hadn't let him near the classrooms, but the message was clear. My private life was now a public rumor. I could already imagine the version of me that would be sold in court. Single mom, unstable, mixed up with criminals, unfit. Paper could do that. It had done it to Emily for 2 years. Damien didn't show up with speeches. He sent structure. Vince brought me a folder with the name of a family attorney Torres trusted, plus another for a separate custody specialist who wouldn't be dazzled by tabloids. A driver took Noah to school with a route that changed daily. Mrs. Whitman helped me gather documents I'd never wanted to need. Daycare receipts, pay stubs, vaccination records, every proof that I was a steady parent. When I hesitated, Vince made it plain that pride was expensive and safety was not optional anymore. I hated how quickly I started relying on that machinery. One phone call and appointments appeared. One text, and my name stopped floating around the staff group chat at Soto Luz like gossip. It felt like cheating, like I was borrowing power I hadn't earned. But I also knew what the other option looked like. Me standing alone in front of a judge, trying to explain why an outreach logo made my hands shake. Caleb had used credibility as a weapon. Now I had to build my own shield without letting it swallow me. That night, Noah asked why we weren't in our apartment. He held his lighthouse drawing up to the lamp and said it looked brighter here. I kissed his hair and told him we were staying someplace quiet for a little while. He accepted it the way kids accept weather, then asked if I was mad at him. The question broke me. I held him until his breathing slowed, and I promised myself that whatever story adults told, my son would never wonder if he caused it. Torres warned me the arrests would be only the beginning. Prosecutors would want Emily's statement formalized, and defense teams would start working the angle of instability, manipulation, and scandal. My ex would love that angle. I could already see the headlines in my head, the kind that reduce women to mistakes. Damien's people could keep us physically safe, but they couldn't stop whispers, and whispers were what judges heard when they pretended not to. On the morning the first court dates were mentioned, I stood at the brownstone window with Noah's hand in mine and watched the city pretend it was normal again. Sirens passed. A delivery bike splashed through a puddle. Somewhere, Caleb's lawyers were building their own paper fortress, and somewhere else my ex was polishing his role as the reasonable parent. I squeezed Noah's fingers and felt the truth settle. Safety can bind you as tightly as love, sometimes tighter. If I stayed hidden, we might stay calm today. If I stepped into the courtroom storm, Emily's truth might survive tomorrow. I didn't know which cost I could afford, but I knew the decision was coming fast. That night I laid Noah's backpack by the door like a shield and checked my reflection until I looked steady. In a few days, windowless rooms would decide who was believed. I promised myself I would not let paper erase us again. At 6:30 a.m., the courthouse looked like every other building that pretends it holds truth. Gray stone, flags hanging wet, security lights still on. The driver dropped me a block away so nobody could photograph Noah's face if someone recognized my name. I walked alone through misty rain, clutching my canvas tote like it contained oxygen. Inside were daycare receipts, my custody papers, and Noah's lighthouse drawing folded flat between 2 folders, the only soft thing I trusted. The entrance smelled of metal and stale coffee. A guard waved a wand over my coat, and the beep of the scanner made my nerves jump. No windows in the hallway, just fluorescent panels that turned every face tired and a little sick. Doors clicked shut behind people with the finality of vaults. I kept thinking how easy it would be for a story to die in a place like this, sealed away from sunlight. Torres met me near a bench with vinyl cushions worn shiny from other people's fear. She didn't reassure, she organized. She pointed me toward a small waiting room and laid out what order things would happen in and where I should sit so I wouldn't be surrounded. Her calm steadied my breath, but it didn't erase the fact that my life was now a case file. I could feel every camera outside even though this hallway had none. Emily sat in the corner of the waiting room with Mrs. Whitman beside her. Emily's hands trembled around a paper cup of water. She had brushed her hair back and pulled on a plain sweater, like she was trying to look ordinary enough to be believed. Her eyes kept drifting to the closed door as if it might open into the past. I watched her swallow hard, once, twice, rehearsing courage the way I rehearsed smiles on double shifts. When the attorneys filed in, I felt the air change. The defense team moved like they owned the building, suits crisp, expressions bored. Their strategy wasn't to argue the facts, it was to bend the listener's attention. They emphasized mental health words, repeated terms from Dr. Reeves' old paperwork, and tried to make Emily sound dramatic, inconsistent, overly emotional. They suggested she had been influenced by outsiders, guided by people with agendas. Every time they said outsider, I felt them aiming at me. I kept my face still, but my stomach rolled. I imagined them dragging my name into it. Waitress, single mother, connected to a feared man through a restaurant booth. They didn't need to say Damien Cross out loud. The implication lived in the pauses. They hinted at intimidation, at fabricated stories, at a rescue staged by criminals. Their boredom made it worse, like cruelty was routine work. The morning blurred into long stretches of waiting. Papers shuffled louder than they should. Someone's heel clicked the same rhythm over and over in the hallway, like a countdown. Emily was called in, and the door shut. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the weight of her voice being examined, sliced, labeled. I held Noah's drawing in my bag with my fingertips, tracing the crayon lighthouse through fabric, reminding myself what I was fighting for. And halfway through the day, I almost left. The thought came sharp and clean. Disappear. Stay quiet. Protect your custody. Let professionals handle it. I pictured Noah's face if a judge decided I was reckless. My chest tightened so hard I had to stand and breathe in the restroom. I told myself I was allowed to choose safety. Then I remembered Noah watching me zip his backpack every morning, watching me apologize when I was wrong, watching me stand up to a landlord who tried to cheat us. He learned what love looked like from what I tolerated. If I ran now, I would be teaching him that truth is optional when it costs too much. I washed my hands, not to scrub fear away, but to steady them, and I walked back to the bench. Damien never entered the building. I knew that was deliberate. His presence would have given the defense a carnival. Still, on his protection sat in the background like quiet scaffolding, the same driver waiting outside, a lawyer's business card in my pocket, a text from Vince checking if Noah had been picked up from school safely. The help felt practical, not tender, and I clung to it anyway because motherhood doesn't reward pride. When Emily came out, her face was pale but set, like she had crossed a bridge and refused to look down. Torres nodded once, satisfied in a way only a person with facts can be. The prosecutor spoke with her in the corridor, and I caught only the shape of it. They had what they needed for today, but the defense would keep grinding. The case was moving forward, inch by inch, under fluorescent lights. By late afternoon, the judge dismissed the room for the day, and the jury was sent away to weigh what they'd heard. People filed out slowly, as if leaving might break whatever fragile courage was holding them upright. I sat back on the bench and unfolded Noah's lighthouse drawing. The red door he colored looked brighter than any courthouse light. I wondered if justice was real, or if we were all just telling ourselves stories until the verdict proved it. 2 days after I unfolded Noah's lighthouse drawing on that courthouse bench, the decision finally arrived. The hallway still smelled of burnt coffee and copier heat, and my palms were damp inside my coat pockets. Emily sat beside Mrs. Whitman, shoulders squared like she was holding herself together with string. Torres watched the courtroom door without blinking. When the jurors filed in, the room tightened, and every shuffle of paper sounded like thunder. The foreperson spoke, the judge nodded, and I felt the air leave my lungs in one clean rush. I did not cheer. I simply started breathing again. The sentences came later, heavier, because numbers make harm feel official. Caleb Harrow received 42 years, and the courtroom did not gasp so much as harden. A wealthy developer who hid behind donations got 27. A board director who signed checks and looked away got 18. Dr. Marcus Reeve, the man who stamped lies into medical language, was stripped of his license and given 7. Torres never celebrated, she just kept her notes neat, as if dignity mattered even now. I kept thinking that no number could return stolen years, but at least the clock had turned for us tonight. Outside the courthouse, winter wind cut through my scarf, and the city kept walking as if nothing had happened. I called Mrs. Diaz to confirm Noah was safe. Then I sat in the back seat of the car and let my face collapse for a minute. Relief didn't feel like joy. It felt like my muscles finally unclenched after months of guarding every breath. Emily cried in the hallway, not loud, just shaking, and I understood her tears were proof she'd been heard. That night I tucked Noah in and admitted silently that healing would be slower than justice alone. About a month later, I was back on the floor at Soto Luce, moving plates and pretending the past hadn't stained the walls. The restaurant sounded the same. Ice and shakers, forks against china, the low murmur of money. Yet I was different. I checked exits without meaning to. I watched men's hands, not their smiles. The corner booth still belonged to Damian Cross, and he still sat with his back to the wall, untouched bourbon in front of him. Vince nodded at me once, like a silent receipt that I had survived. I thought the story was finished. Wrong. It was a clear evening when the front door opened and Emily walked in, not running, not soaked, not bleeding, just steady. She wore a coat that fit and boots that looked new but not flashy, and her hair was shorter, like she'd cut off a season. She paused by the host stand, scanning the room the way a person does when they are choosing to be seen. I felt the old panic rise, then fall, because she wasn't asking for rescue. She was bringing closure on her own terms. She walked straight toward the corner booth. I followed behind. Emily didn't sit. She held out a folded piece of paper, edges pressed sharp, and placed it on the table near Damian's untouched glass. She didn't look at him like a fan or a victim. She looked like someone returning a borrowed lifeline. Then she turned to leave, and I understood she wanted no more debts. The letter was not a confession of love. It was gratitude for one human question asked at the right moment, the question that treated her as a person instead of a case file. Being believed had given her a future, and she left free. Damian stayed in the booth after she was gone, the restaurant noise flowing around him like water around stone. He picked up the paper, unfolded it with care that surprised me, and read it once, then again. His face didn't soften into something safe, but the hardness behind his eyes shifted, the way a weight shifts in your chest when you finally exhale. He slipped the letter into his jacket, close to his heart, and looked out the window as if checking the sky for ghosts. Vince watched him quietly, and for once said nothing at all. I understood that. I went back to work, refilling water glasses, taking orders, hearing laughter that had no idea what had happened on our floor. Trauma doesn't pause service. It gets folded into routines and carried anyway. My hands shook less than before, but my attention stayed sharp. I kept Noah's drawing in my purse, and I stopped apologizing for needing safety. I didn't mistake Damien's restraint for goodness, yet I couldn't deny the difference between a man who asked a question and a man who hid behind paperwork. I learned that power can destroy, but it can also hold a door open. When I locked up after midnight, streetlights glittered on pavement, and I realized my life was no longer just shifts and custody math. Emily had walked out of Soto Luz by choice, and that image stayed with me. Damien remained a storm in a suit, but the letter had moved something in him, and it made me wonder what could grow after a stone shifts. I went home to Noah, kissed his forehead, and felt an answer that wasn't fear. Boundaries, rebuilding, and a future I would choose. Tomorrow would not be about court. It would be about living again. Months passed after the sentencing, and the city found new scandals to stare at. For me, the aftershocks lived in small places. A siren outside my window, the click of a lock, the way rain could make my heart sprint. I moved Noah and myself into a smaller place with a better door and a brighter stairwell. I learned to breathe through ordinary mornings again, even when my hands still wanted to count exits. Healing didn't arrive as a miracle. It arrived as routines I kept anyway. At night, I taped his lighthouse drawing above the desk, my quiet reminder. Emily started classes at City College in the fall, choosing a track that scared her in the best way. She wanted to learn how systems fail and how to spot the paperwork tricks before they trap someone else. Some days she looked strong, shoulders back, voice steady. Other days she went silent at the sound of keys or footsteps, and I understood progress is not a straight line. She met with counselors, joined a support group, and practiced saying her own name like it belonged to her. She wasn't cured. She was building. Week by week, she wrote future plans. I went back to work full-time, but I stopped pretending I could do everything alone. I kept the attorney's card in my wallet and documented every exchange with Noah's father, because fear taught me to treat my life like evidence. The custody threats didn't vanish, but they lost their sharpest edge when I showed up calm, prepared, and consistent. I paid rent on time. I cooked more real dinners. I let Noah pick weekend plans that didn't involve running. Most importantly, I learned to say no without apologizing, even to people who spoke like authority. That changed my posture. Still, some nights I woke up hearing that restaurant door slam in my head. I would lie still, listening to Noah breathe, and wonder how close we came to being swallowed by someone with a nice smile and clean paperwork. I kept therapy appointments I never thought I deserved, because I wanted Noah to grow up with a mother who didn't live in constant alarm. We made a rule. We talk about fear out loud, not as shame, but as information. He learned to find trusted adults. I learned to trust myself. On Sundays, we baked, and I felt steadier. One afternoon, Torres sent me an update through Vince, the kind of message that read like a receipt. Harbor Lights buildings weren't being reopened under new paint. They were being replaced. A new nonprofit had filed papers, hired vetted staff, and opened safe apartments with strict audits, security, and counseling access. Scholarships were set aside for survivors and for kids aging out of unstable homes. The funding trail was clean, routed through layers that kept names off the front page. But Torres hinted the money came from someone who hated predators more than publicity. I understood. The stone had moved. That didn't turn Damien into a saint, and I didn't pretend it did. I kept my distance on purpose. When he offered help, I accepted only what protected Noah and the case, never what would make me dependent. He seemed to respect that boundary the way he respected locks, by not touching them. He didn't ask me to belong to his world. He let me return to mine, and that restraint was its own kind of gravity. Sometimes I caught his gaze across Soto Luz, steady and unreadable, and I reminded myself, Noah first, always. Anything else would cost much. The whole story still circled back to one moment. A powerful man kneeling and checking if a terrified girl actually knew her pursuer. That single question cracked a rigged system because it forced the room to see her as human. I've taught Noah that calm faces are not always safe, and loud fear is not always wrong. We practice noticing a kid who looks cornered, an adult who won't let someone speak, a friend who suddenly goes quiet. We don't play hero. We look for help, and we stay together. Belief, I learned, is an action. It can save lives. On the first night, I felt truly calm again. It wasn't dramatic. Noah fell asleep with his dinosaur under his chin, and I didn't check the locks 3 times. Rain tapped the window softly, not like an attack. I made tea, sat at the table, and let silence be silence. I thought about Emily walking through the front door, about Torres filling folders with truth, about a new program opening quietly in a city that likes shiny lies. The world stayed imperfect, but it felt less hopeless. Under that weight, something green started to grow, and I finally let it. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with my story. If it moved you, please like the video. I share it with someone who needs a courage, and leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. Was it the rain-soaked back door, the paper shield cracking, the mother on the stoop, or the folded letter on the booth table? I read your words, and they matter. And one more thing, from one human to another. What is the one question you wish someone had asked you when you needed help, before you learned to go quiet?